I always have to check. Whoever puts that up there always throws me off. They throw it on one side or the other, and I have to guess when I get up here and walk. Okay, which side is it on? So I stand and I'm looking to see where I'm at. Anyways, not important to what we're doing as we're continuing our series, talking about the picture of the church and what it looks like without elders. Man, there's a lot of you here today. Did you guys invite friends? This is great. Uh, We're talking about spiritual leadership. We're talking about the picture of what does the church look like when she doesn't have elders. And we began last week by talking about an instance where James and John came to Jesus and asked him a question. They asked him that when he came into his glory, if they might sit on his right and his left. And Jesus concludes this section by telling them that even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. And now there's a lot to unpack in that section, and we did so last week. But what we realized in that beginning text is that the idea of servant leadership begins with a change of your mind. It begins with you changing your mind about how you're going to fit into the body. I think it's safe for us to say that many of us have had good bosses and we've had bad bosses. We've had bosses we've really loved and really loved to work for, and we were enthusiastic about, are they on shift today? And we wanted to work for them. And we've had bosses we're like, oh my gosh, I'm going to try to avoid this guy all day. Long before I was a preacher, I did have a secular job. Okay, I didn't always do preaching. I worked in a grocery store. And I started as a bagger in the beginning. And there were a couple of, head clerks, which they managed the clerks and the bag boys. And, there was one guy there that I just really got along with. Thought he was awesome. Hung out with him all the time, liked to skateboard, longboard. We did all sorts of things. Just super athletic guy. And then a new guy came in. And he was really cool too. And he was, in a different way, I connected with him, although we didn't have similar life circumstances. At work, he was somebody who built me up, who was somebody who gave me projects that I wasn't supposed to be doing. He was somebody that showed me how to work in progression, how to continue to level up, to expand my knowledge. Yeah, sometimes he could be a stickler and he wanted people to follow the rules, but most of the time he was somebody that when he was on shift, you were just like, man, this is awesome, because he was somebody who just encouraged and built you up and pushed you in the right direction. And then in contrast, there was another guy. He was the guy who told you what to do, but didn't do it himself. He was the guy who literally bossed you around. That if you weren't doing exactly the movements that he expected you to do, he was on your case. And he was a terror to work for. He was the kind of guy where you would do something differently than the way that he showed you, and the next minute he's pushing you aside doing it himself. He was the type of guy, when you were on shift with him, you avoided his presence. If he was walking down the same aisle and you saw him, you turned around and walked the other direction. Now, this is not just my opinion of this man. This was the consensus of the entire workplace. And later I learned kind of why that guy was like that, and his circumstances were difficult. His life was kind of falling apart, and he was just a jerk to people, everybody. But the guy that I really wanted to be like was the guy that encouraged and built and moved me in a positive direction. The guy I didn't want to be around or even see was the guy that constantly tore me down. The guy that constantly made sure I was put in my place. The guy that constantly held his rod of authority over my head and beat me with it. Those are not the kinds of leaders we want to follow. We don't want to follow people who use their title as a license to wield their power, to wield their authority, to make you do something because they simply have the power to make you do it. Right? People in our world tend to believe that titles make someone a leader, right? If you have a title, if you're a boss, if you're a manager, it makes you're a leader, right? But it doesn't make you a good one. It doesn't make you a bad one. Sure, it might give you power, right? It might give you authority. It might give you a right to something, right? It might make you a boss, but it doesn't make you a leader. And there's evidence and there's argument for what a leader actually is. And we talked about it last week. That a leader is a servant, and there is no other kind of leadership. There is only servant leadership. Every leader you know, every individual you want to follow that encourages and builds and pushes you in the right direction is not an individual who thinks too highly of himself. But he understands that he as a leader is a means to an end, not the end. So as we begin to diagram this and look at what it means for us as a body, as we begin to function together, as we begin to work towards building our body, our relationships here, our fellowship, our community, we have to understand that a title doesn't make us a leader, but a mindset and a servant attitude will organically push the leaders to the top. It will organically make you say, wow, what is he doing? A leader won't beat you over the head with a rod. But what we have to understand and what we have to know is that this is simply untrue. This cannot be an attitude we have in the church, somebody's title, somebody's, and I don't think we have that. But as we begin to look to spiritual leaders, we begin to create ministries in this church that allow us to not only reach the outside community, but reach the body within. Because in reality, church, we need to focus more on fellowship. We need to focus on getting to know one another. We don't know each other. We may think we know each other, but do you really know each other? Do you really know well, some of you are sitting next to your spouses, so don't take this too seriously. But do you really know the person sitting next to you? How about on the other side of the room? Do you know that person? Do you know who they are? See, it's important for us to if you really want to find out what a thriving church looks like, if you really want to see that, people know each other. And I'm not talking about just like high and by short talk in the foyer or the fellowship hall. I'm talking about intimately know each other. You know the struggles, you know the problems, you know the challenges, you know the issues that they're facing. And all of that, leaders organically rise to the top as you create ministries that reach within and out of the body. But the thing we have to understand about leadership is simply this, that leadership is influence. It is influence. There is no other element here that we can attribute to leadership other than influence. And how do you build influence with people? Well, you got to get to know people, right? And you don't do it because you want to gain it. There can't be an ill will behind this because it just makes everything messy. When you have an ill will behind trying to be a leadership and trying to be nice to people and trying to be kind to people, number one, it comes off as fake. Number two, you won't get very far. This has to be a genuine care for other people. You have to genuinely care about your neighbor. You have to genuinely think about the person sitting next to you. I mean, when we look at the life of Jesus, that's what he did. He didn't prostrate himself as some ginormous figure. He came and he served people. And he influenced people. And he didn't do it with an iron fist. And he didn't do it with a rod of authority. He did it with humility. And to think about that, just think about that for a second. A guy who could have done anything he wanted in this world chose to come in the form of a man and serve people. Us. Chose us. Why? He could have done anything he wanted. Why us? At times it doesn't make any sense, but then you look at his life and you look at his ministry in Galilee and in other places, and you realize that he was setting a standard, that he was showing what it looks like when God and man co-rule and reign together. When man is whole and not broken, when man seeks to serve others, when man humbly submits himself, God, when man understands that he is not the ruler and reigner of his own life, what does the world look like? And what do people look like? Leadership is influence. Leadership is not just an influence, though. It's a responsibility. It's not just a banner you wave or a rod you hold or a title you have. It's an influence, it's influence and it's responsibility on your part that if you are somehow pushed to the top as someone who is leading a ministry or serving people from the trenches, that it becomes a responsibility for you as an individual. Now, the people in Jesus' day were mismanaging this responsibility. They were mismanaging their influence. If you go back to Matthew chapter 6, verses 1 through 18, this is where Jesus really draws out the inconsistencies of the scribes and the Pharisees. In fact, he calls them hypocrites, pretenders, play actors. And he says, when they pray, they stand on the corner and they blow a trumpet. When they fast, they don't wash their faces. When they give, they make sure people know they give. And Jesus, as he's moving through his ministry, is using them as an illustration for what he doesn't want his disciples to be when he's ascended to the right hand of God. I mean, think about that. It's incredible. And so Matthew 23 comes along, where after there's this discussion of well, what is the greatest commandment? He comes to his disciples because people aren't understanding the situation. And he says this, then Jesus spoke to the crowd and to his disciples, saying, the scribes and Pharisees have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. They have seated themselves in the chair of Moses, which is interesting for a moment, if you'll indulge me. They have seated themselves. Doesn't mean given to them. They have seated themselves in the chair of Moses, meaning they have been given or they have taken the authority that Moses was given to direct people within the law. Look what he says. Therefore, all that they do, all that they tell you, do and observe. What do you mean? They've seated themselves there. You're telling us that what they tell you, do and observe. It doesn't make any sense, Jesus. But pay attention to the next part. Do not do according to their deeds, which is what he said in Matthew chapter 6. Do not do according to their deeds. I mean, you've seen people in this world that you want to be like and people that you don't want to be like, right? You've seen bosses that you want to be like. You've seen bosses that you don't want to be like. You've seen husbands that you want to be like. You've seen husbands you don't want to be like. You've seen mothers you want to be like and mothers you don't want to be like. You have a contrasted comparison for analysis of how you do things moving forward. And this is what Jesus is going to begin to teach the disciples. And he's going to ingrain in their mind. He says in Mark chapter 10 and verse 41, when he begins to talk about the Gentiles, he says, the Gentiles have authority and they lord it over people. They have power and they lord it over them. And then he says, but among you, it is not this way. It's Mark chapter 10. It is not this way, but the greatest among you shall be your servant. And I think it's interesting that what he wants them to understand about all of this is that you're not to shape yourselves in the likeness of people who pretend to be somebody. But as you shape and form yourself in your spiritual journey, you're to shape and form yourself in the likeness of me, in the likeness of Jesus. Do not do according to their deeds, for they say things and do not do them. You know people like that too, don't you? You know Christians like that. Maybe a little bit more than we're willing to admit. That don't practice privately what they preach publicly. That say one thing, look a certain way, act a certain way, are a certain way amongst the rest of the Sunday Christians. And then they're living in an entirely different world when they leave the building doors. It's not the way we want to live. That's not the way Jesus calls us to live. Look at this. They tie up, he's talking about the Pharisees, they tie up heavy burdens and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are unwilling to move them with so much as a finger. They tell you to do stuff, go do this, go do that, go be this, go be that. But we're not going to do it. It's not how you influence people. It's not how you grow the kingdom. That's not how you develop spiritual maturity. That's not how you progress forward and trying to become like Jesus. That's not how we do things. We don't tell people to do something and then not do them ourselves. You know, I learned a hard lesson in this before I was a Christian. I had a neighbor who about the same time was studying Christianity. He was going to a different church than I was, but we would constantly debate back and forth on different ideas. And I was sold on the idea of baptism, but I wasn't baptized. And we're sitting there talking and having this conversation, and I'm showing him all these verses of where it says you need to do this. And one simple question changed the entirety of my mindset. He said, well, have you done it? Nobody's ever asked me that before. Have you done it? You're saying all of these things, look at the scripture, look at the text, but you haven't done it. So why are you telling me to do it? It doesn't work that way. If I tell my daughter she has to brush her teeth every night and I don't do it, well, what does that make me? If I tell my daughter she has to sit still in church and, well, that's not true. I don't, and she doesn't, because, you know, she's like her father. And, you know, I'm telling you, people, if my parents would have raised me in church, I'd have been the same way. I'd have been running all over the place. They wouldn't have been able to keep me. They would have had to strap my arms to my sides. Anyways, not important. They are unwilling to lift with so much of a finger. Practice what you preach is the message here. But they do all their deeds to be noticed by men. There it goes back to the Sermon on the Mount. They do all of their deeds to be noticed by men. What do you do your works for? Why do you do the good things for other people? Why do you pray before you eat? Why do you come to church on Sunday? Why do you do all those things? Do you do them to be seen by other people or even to be seen within your own body? Or do you do them because they're a part of who you are? That in secret, they're a part of your relationship with God. Look at this. They broaden their phylacteries. That's a fancy word for, you know, Jewish men in morning prayer would wear a box on their forehead and a strap on their left arm when they went to morning prayer. And maybe for some period of time, the idea was that they were to remind them of what God had done. But these Pharisees had taken that far out of context and they had broadened them so as to make them visible. Look how spiritual I am. Look how spiritual I am. Look at me. But then they don't do what they tell others to do. It doesn't make any sense. And lengthen the tassels on their garments. I want to be visible. I want to be seen. I want to be seen by people. It doesn't matter to me if I'm seen by God or not. It only matters if I'm seen by people. It's the wrong mindset. It's the wrong attitude. It's the wrong idea. If you're sitting in a position of where you have an opportunity to show somebody a better way, where you have an opportunity to influence someone's life for the better, to tell them to do something and then not do it, or to make a religious appearance to them is not a good way to practice servant leadership. Look what he says. They loved the place of honor and the banquets and the chief seats in the synagogues and respectful greetings in the marketplaces and being called rabbi. See what he's doing here? They love all the things about being the religious leaders, but they don't love any of the things that they have to do being a religious leader. They only want to do things that glorify self. They don't really want to do things that glorify God. They want to do things that put the spotlight on them and make them look good. and they want to tell other people what to do, but they don't want to do it themselves. And then Jesus goes into what seems like a rant, but he's telling them something important. Look at this. Do not be called rabbi, for one is your teacher, and you are all brothers. Do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your Father who is in heaven. Do not be called leaders, for one is your leader, that is Christ. This is not about the idea of having, that Jesus doesn't want us to be called anything or to have any offices or to be unofficial. What he's saying here is simply avoid the pride and prestige that come with titles, that puts you in a position of power and authority, and you can make people do. That's not what it's about. See, that's what they like to do. One is your leader. This could actually be translated teachers. One is your teacher. Do not be called teachers or instructors, for one is your instructor, the Christ. Do not be called rabbi. These are formalities. These are positions. These are titles for people. And he says, you got to avoid these. But then look at the bombshell he drops at the end of this. But the greatest among you shall be your what? Servant. The greatest among you should be your servant. We want to know what it looks like for a body of Christ to thrive. Man, it begins in your mind. It begins with your attitude. It begins with you looking at yourself as a servant of the kingdom of God, and only a servant. A title doesn't mean anything. It doesn't matter who stands up here and does the talking. It doesn't matter who leads the singing. It doesn't matter who does the prayers or what you dress like when you come to church. None of that matters. Maybe aesthetically it matters. But what really matters is how you see yourself. This is why it's so important that it has to change within your mind. It has to change within you. First, what am I really in the kingdom of God? What am I really amongst my body of fellow believers? Am I wanting to be served, or am I wanting to serve? And if I do want to be served, how do I change my mindset to become a servant-like individual? The point we can draw from this is simply this. Spiritual leaders are servant leaders. True spiritual leadership is servant leadership. There is no other kind of leadership. And we're not talking about, look, men and women alike, whether it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. What matters is simply this. What are you doing to serve other people? What are you doing to serve your brethren? And then what arises out of that is organic, is natural. It's what does that look like, church? What does that look like for us? When we dream about how the body functions together, moves together, serves the world, serves one another. What does it look like when we're fighting to serve one another? I mean, because if we take care of the internal first, the external will take care of itself. If you change what's in your heart, I mean, this is true for non-believers. This is true for people in the church. If you change what's inside first, you won't have to worry about what changes on the outside. It will naturally flow through you. When you change your mind or make a decision or have an idea of a direction that you want to go, change that inside first. The outside takes care of itself. And this is the heart of what Jesus is getting at. The Pharisees and scribes had a heart problem that they weren't taking care of, that they weren't managing properly, that they weren't looking at and saying, am I really doing this for God? Am I really doing this for the Lord, or am I doing it for self-glorification? And in all that, have I become self-righteous? And the point that Jesus is drawing out is unbelievable. Because what he's telling them is, You got to practice what you preach. You have to become what you want to influence others to become. The spiritual, untitled leadership of the church places its emphasis on serving. The spiritual, untitled leadership of the church places its emphasis on serving. You want to know what a good eldership looks like? They're servants. You want to know what good leaders look like? They're servants. You know them, you've seen them, you have something to compare and contrast in your mind. You have something to see, you have something to look for. Look amongst yourselves. What does that look like for us, church? Now, I think there's three things we have to pull out of here before we move on to the next section, because we're going to kind of continue this series till we get to December 8th when we have our first family meeting, our first congregational meeting, where we're going to discuss what the body looks like. What ministries do we need that have left that have left us when we lost our elders? Well, what is that? What do we really lose when we lost elders? And how can we as a body work together to fill in those gaps? What are you passionate about as an individual? What do you love? What do you love to do? And how can you turn that into a ministry? You see, because when we look at it from a ministry perspective, when we begin to try and figure out ways to serve internally and externally, spiritual leaders naturally arise. So there's a few things we need to consider as individuals going forward. One, you need to practice privately what you preach publicly. That has to be a must. You have to live authentically. You cannot put on an image here and an image where people are seeing you and be completely different inside your home. It just doesn't work, folks. We have to be the same 100% of the time. We have to be people who are looking at ourselves first and saying, what are my faults? What are my gaps? What are my shortcomings? And if I'm telling other people that they shouldn't do them and I'm doing them, well, then something in my life needs to change. I have to live as authentically as I can. I have to practice privately what I preach publicly. Number two, do without expecting a return. You know, there's a world out there of favors, right? If I do this for you, you do this for me. Politics is really big in this, okay? I know it's a little touchy right now, but you do this for me, I'll do this for you. And it kind of becomes messy and sticky and dirty, and you expect a return, and then when you don't get that return, what happens? Well, you get angry. As Jesus followers, we should serve without expecting a return. We should do something nice for someone because Jesus tells us to do good deeds, not simply because we want other people to see us or because we're expecting something back. But if we're going to be a church that thrives as God desires us to become, we have to do without expectation of a return. We have to do without expecting to get back what we put in. Imagine if the church poured into one another all the time. If you were constantly filling someone else's cup and they were constantly filling your cup, what would this body look like? If we constantly were just into one another all the time, pouring in and putting out effort and never expecting anything in return, this body thrives more than we can even imagine. But with that comes another thing we have to consider. Number three, have a humble attitude. I think these are things that Jesus points out to people. And I think they're things that we need to recognize as followers of Jesus. We have to practice what we preach. We have to live authentically. We have to do without expectation of return. I mean, what I'm asking us to do is to focus that internally first. Let's focus those things on one another right now. Let's start practicing what we preach amongst our fellow believers. Let's be gracious and kind towards one another when they mess up or make mistakes. Let's confess our sins to one another. Let's tell each other what's going on. Let's really get to know who we are. Because I think when we do that, the expectations of perfection flies right out the window. I think when you truly know one another, you let your guard down and you become a family. You become a people who works together organically. Yes, families have problems and there's always a problem child. And somebody always says something they don't mean. I get it. That's family. That's people. But if we get to know one another, the dynamic changes. When you really know, I mean, think about this. When you really know the person sitting next to you, how much grace do you have for them? When you know who they are, what they struggle with, what they fail with, what they contemplate, circulate. I mean, there is an immense more amount of grace than when you're sitting across the room looking at somebody who you simply shake their hand in the foyer. That's not really knowing each other, church. If we're going to grow and thrive, we got to know each other. It means we got to put time, effort, and we got to sacrifice some things so we can get together, so we can be together, so we can work together, so we can find out what this body looks like. So we can find out who our leaders are, so we can find out how to serve one another, so we can figure out what it looks like to function as God desires us to become. If we want to accomplish that dream, we have to start by praying for one another. We have to start by getting to know one another. Get out of your comfort zone. Right now, let's just make can we, make up a contract, John? Can you write up a contract that everybody's gonna do something today that makes them uncomfortable? Or tomorrow, if that's do something that makes you uncomfortable. Get outside that circle that you've stayed in for years and approach somebody you don't know. Have a conversation. Ask them questions. Genuinely care about that person you're interested with. Get to know them. And then all these principles that we're trying to apply and trying to put in place, they come together naturally if we're focused on serving like Jesus. If you're here today and you have a need of some kind, if you would like to obey the gospel of Jesus, we offer an opportunity of the singing of the invitation song for you to come forward and sit on a pew and let that be known to the congregation. But what I would really like to encourage you to do is if you have a confession of sin or you want to take that next step in your faith journey, and this is not a comfortable space for you, that's okay. But you have to let somebody know. Find somebody you trust. Find somebody in here. You can talk to people like Stephen, and you can talk to people like John, and you can talk to people like William and Dell, and you can talk to people like Rhodey. And you can talk to people like Pierre and Jason, and you can let them know what your needs are. And what I'm asking, if somebody comes to you, don't hesitate to pray with them right there. Don't hesitate. Just pray with them. Write it down on a list and continue to pray for them. Share a struggle that you have with them too. But most of all, listen to what they have to say. If you have a need, you can come forward as we stand and sing.